You've probably never heard of Lady Han. She was a Korean woman in her mid-20s, sent to the Forbidden City as tribute, imprisoned for 3 years, and then hanged by white silk cord because the emperor she served had died. She was not alone. 16 women died with her. The machinery that killed them had been running for centuries. And it did not stop because anyone had a change of heart. May 22, 1424. The Forbidden City, Beijing. 16 women are led into a hall inside the palace and given a final meal. Court musicians play. Some of them eat. Some of them cannot. By the end of the day, all 16 will be dead, hanged by white silk cord in a chamber built for exactly this purpose, and sealed into the tomb of the man who ruled them. One of them is a Korean woman in her mid-20s. Her name, recorded in the annals of the kingdom that sent her here as tribute 14 years earlier, is Lady Han. She has already survived one purge inside these walls. She will not survive this one. The man they are being killed for is Zhu Di, the Yongle Emperor, the third ruler of the Ming Dynasty, the man who moved the Chinese capital to Beijing and built the Forbidden City itself. He has been dead 3 days. Nothing about his reign required this. Nothing about Confucian law demanded it. He gave no instruction, so far as any surviving record shows, that these women die with him. They died anyway. Because 40 years earlier, his father had decided that a Chinese emperor should be buried the way a Mongol Khan was buried. And once that decision was made, it did not matter what the son wanted. The machine ran on its own. This is the story of that machine, where it came from, who built it, who it killed, and the one man who finally, quietly, shut it off. The practice is called Junzang. It means, roughly, to be buried in following. Its roots go back to Yinxu, near modern Anyang in China's Hunan province, the last capital of the Shang dynasty and the oldest Chinese civilization confirmed by physical excavation. Archaeologists working the site since 1928 have pulled more than 100,000 fragments of oracle bone from the ground, turtle shell and cattle bone, inscribed with questions Shang kings put to their ancestors about harvests, weather, and war. Alongside the palace foundations and the bronze vessels, they also found sacrificial pits. Some held the remains of dozens of people. A number of the excavated pits held remains numbering in the hundreds. Many of the dead have been identified, through isotope analysis of their bones and teeth, as war captives brought from beyond Shang territory, kept for extended periods, and killed during royal funerals or the consecration of new buildings. The belief behind this was not cruelty for its own sake. Ancient Chinese cosmology held that a person carried 2 souls, one that ascended to heaven, and one that remained bound to the body. The dead did not vanish. They relocated, to a mirror world that needed the same things the living world needed: food, servants, companions. A king buried without his household was a king sent into the next world in disgrace. That belief, historians of early China generally agree, is what the Shang pits represent. For roughly 1,000 years after the Shang fell to the Zhou dynasty around 1046 BCE, the practice receded. The Zhou substituted clay and wood figures for living ones. By the time the Han dynasty rose in 206 BCE, mass human sacrifice at court was formally treated as a relic of a cruder age. The lineage that would later produce the terracotta army was, in part, a lineage of surrogates, objects standing in for people who no longer had to die. Then the Mongols arrived. The Yuan dynasty, founded by the descendants of Genghis Khan, brought steppe funerary custom into a Chinese court for the first time in centuries. The Venetian traveler Marco Polo, writing of Mongol funeral processions, claimed that anyone who crossed the path of the cortege was killed on the spot. Yuan court records describe the government publicly commending families who offered wives and daughters for burial alongside a dead ruler, treating it as an act of loyalty worth rewarding. In 1368, the Ming dynasty overthrew the Yuan. Its founder, Zhu Yuanzhang, a man who had been an orphan and a beggar at Buddhist monasteries before rising to found an empire, set about erasing Mongol influence from Chinese court life. He restored Chinese dress. He restored Chinese ceremony. He restored, or claimed to restore, Chinese values. He kept the one Mongol custom that should have died with the Mongols. When Zhu Yuanzhang, posthumously titled the Hongwu Emperor, died in 1398, the Ming History, the official chronicle compiled in the centuries after his reign, records that a number of his concubines were killed and interred with him at the Shaoling Mausoleum outside Nanjing. Later excavation is said to have confirmed multiple sets of remains sealed into the tomb's chambers alongside the emperor and his empress. Historians who have studied the succession crisis Hongwu was managing at the time of his death, his chosen heir had died young, leaving a teenage grandson to inherit a throne surrounded by powerful, battle-hardened uncles, argue that the killings were less about ancestor worship than about clearing the political board. A concubine with a son was a potential kingmaker. Removing her removed the risk. History suggests Hongwu's instinct was correct, if not his solution. Within 4 years of his death, one of those uncles, his fourth son, Zhu Di, marched an army south, deposed his nephew, and took the throne as the Yongle Emperor. It is this same Yongle Emperor whose death, in 1424, opens this story. And it is under his reign that the machinery of Junzang collided most directly with a young woman from the Korean peninsula. To understand how she got there, you have to understand what the Ming court demanded of its neighbors. The kingdom of Joseon, on the Korean peninsula, was a tributary state, and part of its tribute obligation was women. Over the course of the dynasty, at least 100 Korean women are recorded as having been sent to the Ming court as offerings. When Ming envoys arrived to conduct a selection, the Joseon government issued proclamations restricting marriage across the entire peninsula until the selection was complete, so that eligible daughters could not be hastily married off to avoid being taken. Families who concealed a daughter faced punishment under Joseon law. Lady Han, of the Cheongju Han clan, according to the Joseon court annals, the Veritable Records, was one of the women selected for the Yongle Emperor's household, prized, the records state, for her beauty. Her brother, a Joseon official named Han Wak, left behind an account of her fate, which is a significant part of why we know her name at all. Most of the women inside the Ming imperial household do not have that. In 1421, 3 years before Yongle's death, the court was consumed by a purge. A concubine had reportedly been involved with a eunuch, and when the affair was discovered, the emperor's response was to investigate a wider conspiracy, an alleged poisoning plot implicating a number of women in the imperial household. The scale of that purge is difficult to state with precision. Later accounts describe executions running into the thousands, though the surviving primary documentation does not allow historians to verify an exact figure, and the number should be treated as reported rather than confirmed. What is better documented is that Lady Han was implicated, and that she was not executed. She was imprisoned. She spent 3 years in that confinement. Then, in 1424, the Yongle Emperor died, and the court began compiling its list. A woman already accused, already isolated, already without political protection, was exactly the kind of woman that list was built for. Tragedy in the abstract, but as a specific, bounded span of time, a woman in her early 20s, aware that the man whose death would decide her fate was, at any given moment, still breathing somewhere else in that same palace, and that his death was the only event that could end her waiting, one way or the other. She was not the only one on that list who asked for another outcome. Another Korean concubine, recorded as Consort E, is said to have knelt before Yongle's successor, the Hongxi Emperor, in the days after the death, and asked to be allowed to return home, telling him her elderly mother had no one else to care for her. The Hongxi Emperor refused. She was hanged and buried with his father regardless. The Ming history does not record how many others made similar requests. It records that hers survived, and that it changed nothing. The mechanics of the killing itself were designed to look like the opposite of what they were. The condemned were given a farewell banquet, a final meal, court musicians playing, served on the same imperial porcelain used in life. Then they were led to a separate chamber, where wooden platforms had been set beneath white silk cords hung from the ceiling beams. White, in Chinese mourning custom, is the color of grief, not celebration. Each woman stepped onto a platform. The platforms were withdrawn. The sequence, banquet, then chamber, then platform, was built to resemble a passage, a transition, rather than an execution. The court's own language reflected this. Later records describe the dead as having been forced or volunteered for burial. That phrase is not a description of choice. It is the language of an institution that needed the appearance of consent while providing none. There was compensation on the other end of this. Families of the dead received honorary titles, land grants, and pensions, sometimes ranking above what a military general might expect to earn. This was not incidental. It ensured that grief and advancement arrived in the same letter, and it meant the families who might otherwise have objected had, instead, a material reason not to. Joseon's court did not formally protest the deaths of its tribute women. Neither, in the surviving record, did their families. Across 5 Ming emperors over roughly 4 decades, the recorded death toll from this practice runs to approximately 100 women. Han Guo, in 1398. Yongle, in 1424, the number of women hanged that day is reported variously, between 16 and 30, depending on the source consulted. The Hongxi emperor, who reigned less than a year before his own death in 1425, is recorded as having 10 concubines interred with him. The Xuande emperor, who died in 1435, is recorded with a similar number, the court having first determined which of his women had borne him children and which had not. Those who had were generally spared. Those who had not were not. That distinction, mother or not, was the entire logic of survival inside the system. A concubine's security rose and fell on whether she produced a son. It was not sentiment. It was policy, understood by every woman inside those walls, and it turned what should have been a household into a court of its own, with its own alliances, its own informants, and its own quiet, ongoing war. The system did occasionally produce a woman who broke it rather than being broken by it. 7 centuries before the Ming, in the Tang Dynasty, a low-ranking concubine named Wu Zhao, a woman who, by the custom of the time, should have been sent to a Buddhist convent for the remainder of her life once the emperor she served had died without her bearing him a child, instead returned to court under his son, outmaneuvered the reigning empress, bore the new emperor's children, and rose from the lowest tier of the concubine hierarchy to empress consort. In 690 CE, she removed her own son from the throne, declared a new dynasty, and crowned herself emperor, not empress. She is the only woman in Chinese history to have held that title in her own name. She ruled for roughly 4 decades, over a period of territorial expansion and administrative reform. The entire premise beneath Junzang, that a concubine was disposable inventory, replaceable and forgettable, did not survive contact with her. The Ming produced no Wu Zhao. Its surveillance was tighter, its hierarchy more rigid, and by the 15th century a growing number of its concubines had bound feet, a practice that in many cases left women physically unable to walk without assistance, let alone maneuver politically. But the Ming did, eventually, produce the man who ended the killing. His name was Zhu Qizhen, the Jingtong emperor, later known by the era name Tianshun after his restoration. By most measures available to historians, he was not a capable ruler. In 1449, at the age of 21, he led a military campaign against the Mongols on the advice of a court eunuch. The campaign ended in catastrophe at the Battle of Tumu Fortress, where the Ming army was destroyed and the emperor himself taken prisoner. He spent roughly a year in Mongol custody. By the time he was returned to Beijing, his own brother had already been placed on the throne in his stead. He spent the next several years confined within the palace before staging a coup in 1457 and reclaiming his position. This was not, by any conventional standard, a great emperor. He trusted the wrong advisors, lost the army he led, and punished loyal officials on his return. And yet, in 1464, dying at the age of 36, he issued a decree abolishing Junzang outright. His will described the practice as uncivilized and forbade the killing of concubines or palace maids at his own funeral or at the funeral of any Ming emperor to follow. Why he did it is something historians still debate rather than something the record settles cleanly. Some point to the influence of his consort, Lady Wan, who bore him children and may have argued against the practice. Others point to a rising current of Confucian scholarly criticism, arguing that sacrificial killing sat uneasily beside the tradition's own stated principles of benevolence. The most direct explanation available is also the simplest: he had spent a year as a captive himself, his life entirely subject to someone else's decision, and he may have understood, in a way his predecessors did not have to, exactly what it meant to wait for that decision to be made. Whatever his reasoning, the decree held. His son inherited the throne without a single concubine being killed to mark the transition, the first time in the dynasty's history that an emperor's death did not require a corresponding list of the condemned. The practice briefly resurfaced under the early Qing, when Manchu rulers including Nurhaci and his son Hong Taiji ordered concubines buried alongside them, before the Kangxi emperor formally and permanently prohibited it in 1673, his ministers arguing that it was cruel and without justification. That prohibition held for the remainder of imperial Chinese history. It did not mean the danger to women inside the palace disappeared. In 1900, as foreign armies advanced on Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion, the Empress Dowager Cixi, by then the effective ruler of China for nearly 4 decades, ordered a young consort named Zhen, who had supported the reform efforts of the emperor she once served, thrown down a well inside the palace grounds. She was 24 years old. The killing required no ritual banquet, no ceremonial court. 400 years after Zhu Qizhen's decree, a woman in that same palace complex could still be killed on the order of the person who controlled it, when it was convenient to do so. None of the Ming tombs north of Beijing where these women were interred have been fully opened, with one exception. The Dingling Mausoleum was excavated in 1956. During the Cultural Revolution a decade later, Red Guards broke into the excavated chamber and destroyed much of what had been recovered. The remains of the emperor and his empresses inside were dragged out and burned. The Chongling Mausoleum, where the Yongle emperor and the 16 women hanged at his death in 1424 are believed to remain, has never been opened. Lady Han is recorded in a Joseon court annal because her brother wrote her story down. Most of the women who died beside her are recorded only as a number in a Chinese court ledger, a count taken, a title granted to a family, a door sealed. The system that killed them did not consider their names worth preserving. It considered the transaction complete once the family had been paid. The killing did not stop because the court grew a conscience. It stopped because one dying, thoroughly unremarkable emperor, a man who had failed at nearly everything else he attempted, decided, once, that this particular failure was not one he was willing to leave behind him. The killing did not stop because the court grew a conscience. It stopped because one dying, thoroughly unremarkable emperor, a man who had failed at nearly everything else he attempted, decided, once, that this particular failure was not one he was willing to leave behind him. What would it take for the machines of our own time to stop? This is what we do at Throne Unknown. We uncover the stories power tried to bury. If you want more, subscribe. Hit the bell. And remember, the machine doesn't stop because it has a conscience. It stops because someone decides to turn it off.